Hi, I'm Michael Bruinix. I'm a clinical social worker at a hospital here in Kingston, Ontario. This is the second part of a video about transference, which is basically the clinical term for when a client has a strong reaction to us, positive or negative, and it could be that we don't understand where it's coming from. Maybe the client doesn't understand or we don't understand. We say something and there's a bizarre reaction, a strong reaction, no reaction. Something's going on where the client is re-experiencing their past right now with us in the therapeutic situation. So working with transference is really important because the client, their whole sense of self, their sense of the world, sense of others is shaped by the relationships they had in the past. And what's happening is when a client's experiencing transference is they're taking their past and they're transferring it onto us. So how do we work with that? In this video, I'm going to be talking about specific therapeutic skills, specific strategies and tactics that you can use in order to work with transference rather than just letting it wash over you or take over your therapeutic session. So when we're thinking about skills, I'm going to show you a couple of different approaches. I'm not saying which one is right. I'm saying that there's a set of tools that can be used when a client's experiencing transference. We want to explore it. We want to work through it. So what do we do? Well, Wilfred Bion in 1960 stated the following, that when we're in therapy with someone, we should approach the therapeutic situation with no memory and no desire. That's an interesting way of approaching therapy, because what it means is that we're just an open container. We're going to let the client interpret us, view us, work with us however they need to. And so having no memory would include something like, normally when a client sits down, you might be tempted to say something like, how was your last week? If you're having weekly appointments, how was last week? How'd that go? Or a client tells you about something they were going to do on the weekend because we want to show that we care. We say, oh, how'd that go on the weekend when you got together with your high school friends? You had a high school reunion, so how'd that go? Now, Bion takes a different approach. What if we didn't make any suggestions at all? In other words, we had no memory of any previous session and we had no desire for an outcome. In other words, we're just holding a space, a safe container where the client can experience us however they need to. So this gets down to, there's been lots of discussion about, do we say hello or not? Or how do we open the door? Or do we smile? Or do we use their name? Because we're talking about having no memory and no desire, right? How literal are we going to take this? Well, you can greet them. You can let them in. But after that, what you want to do is, according to Bion, that's B-I-O-N, what you want to do is be mindful of whether you're doing something that could potentially interrupt the transference pattern that the client wants to place on us. So if we ask them, how is your week? We instantly put them where we want to go, and we're not letting them put the transference on us. So for example, if I sat there smiling comfortably, they'd be like, what's the matter with you? Why don't you ask me a question? Oh, see what just happened there? They had some kind of reaction to me. They thought they had some kind of expectation around how I was going to treat them. Now they're putting me in a role where they're criticizing me potentially, or they're upset by me not reacting in a typical way. And there is a chance for the transference to be explored. Maybe there were other problematic periods of silence in other relationships, and now those are coming to the surface. So why aren't they comfortable with the silence, right? Why do they need to talk or for things to go in a certain way? See, those are all the rules and the roles and the expectations that happen in transference. The other thing about desire is sometimes we get the idea, we get taught the idea, we even get the expectation from leadership that the idea is that the clients have to get better. Now, what if we didn't have that desire? What if we just let the therapeutic session and the therapeutic treatment plan unfold as it will? Well, this is the suggestion that Bion made, is that when we have desire, when we, the clinician or the worker, have desire, we have an agenda. There's a certain place we want to get them. And when we do that, we're not letting the client put their transference on us. So when you're thinking about when we're talking about having outcomes in therapy, because we ultimately get into this type of work because we're compassionate, caring people and we want people to get better. part of letting people get better is to experience their previous relationships and work through them. And when you don't have a desire about an outcome, like we're going to cover 3 things today in this session, so we're going to, we break it down and make steps, or we give them a worksheet or a handout, some material from a workbook that we're working through. This is completely unlike just letting the transference emerge. So that's one way of approaching transference, is having no memory and no desire. If you can keep that in the back of your mind, you may hold on to something you want to say, you feel tempted to say something, but then you don't because you want to see what manifests in terms of transference. That's one approach. Now, I mentioned in the last video about early on, I had difficulty when a client didn't like me, especially if they didn't like me for a long period of time. I specifically gave the example of when working with sexual assault survivors that if I reminded them of their perpetrator in some way, it would upset me. I've been in an outpatient unit clinic working with people with borderline personality disorder, and sometimes they really disliked me for a long period of time. It was really hard to bear. When I had that transference being placed on me, where they were trying to work through a really painful previous relationship, it was hard to take it. Now, when I listened to Dr. Rex K, he said that you should only go as deep in the therapy as you feel equipped that you can handle. Don't go into deeper realms. So, for example, if you have hate in the countertransference, as Winnicott wrote about in 1948, there's a point at which you may not be able to take it. And what I'm saying here is that if we think about Bion's approach of having no memory and desire, that means we just let the transference manifest. But if we look at Dr. Rex K, and his approach to transference is that we have to be empathic up to a point. Heinz Kohut talks about having empathic attunement, being attuned to the sensations and the emotions and the thoughts of the client in front of us. Now, what I'm saying here is that you want to allow it up to a point, whatever you think you can handle. If someone is expressing hate at you from other relationships they had, that can be hard to tolerate. Now, Bion has this concept of containment where we, as mental health professionals, have to process and tolerate the affect that the client can't handle. This is what they're constantly discharging because of wounds to the self that have occurred from other relationships. It's up to us to be able to tolerate that. Not like grit our teeth tolerate it, but just up to a point that we feel like we can handle it. So we have to be able to process and experience the emotions our clients aren't willing to, and part of that happens with transference. Other people that have spoken about that are McAlpine and Greenson, where we have to not discharge our emotions or try to get our uncomfortable emotions out in order to block our client from working through the relationships that they need to work through. So that's another element that I think about when I'm working with transference. A third part I want to talk about is timing and tact. It's very important. One of the tools in transference is often to offer an interpretation. So, for example, a client suddenly gets angry because of something we said, and then we could offer an interpretation like, did I just remind you of your father? That's a very big, direct interpretation. We can use more subtle ones, of course. But let's say we use that. What can happen here is that our timing is off. They're right in the middle of working through something, and then because we want to solve it, cure it, fix it, rescue them from the affect or the emotions that they're experiencing, we might offer an interpretation. When you offer it is very, very important. It's not just, that's one point for sure. So here's an example. I was doing a consultation with another clinician who was saying about how they had a Christmas gift dropped off in their space, in their treatment space. And the person just walked away and left the bag behind. This obviously occurred at Christmas. And they had an urge to call out and ask the person to come back and take the bag away because, of course, they can't accept gifts. So what happened there was she was saying, should I have called out as the person walked away? And I said, well, you could, but the person left that behind for a reason. They put it on one side of their chair, kind of away from her view, and it looked as though, the way the clinician described it to me, that when the person walked away, they just wanted it to stay behind and that it would look like they forgot that they didn't take it with them because the clinician had previously said, I can't accept gifts. There was like a few $100s worth of stuff in this bag. So she said, should I call out? And I said, no. Have another conversation with her the next time. And just let her experience walking away from you, leaving you in that helpless situation. You know, there's no one right answer with transference, right? I mean, there's been so much written about transference. There's no one way. I'm just offering you a small example of how I might handle it if it happened to me. So what I said to the clinician was, what did you feel when she left it behind? And she said, I felt powerless just seeing that gift there. And I felt like, I told her no, and then she didn't listen to me. And I said, why don't you wait to bring that up the next time the client says, I don't know what the problem is. I told this person no, and they didn't listen to me. And you can then raise, well, that reminds me of the time that you left this gift here, and I told you no, I didn't want it. So what do you think's going on there? Now, that's not necessarily the ideal way to handle it, but what I'm talking about here is waiting. And the master clinicians that talk about transference talk about sometimes knowing a fact and waiting weeks, even months, before you reveal it. In other words, when you're beginning to work with transference, you might have an idea like, oh, I know what that is. I know where that's coming from. They said that before. And then you want to quickly jump in. But when working with transference, timing is so important. It's so important. Also, tact. How you say, how you offer the interpretation, how you offer the explanation is really important too. Sometimes we can be too blunt, or we could be too vague and the other person's not picking up on what we're talking about. We're hinting at something, right? So all of that takes time. Those are clinical skills, timing and tact, when offering a transference interpretation. But what I want you to think about here is that when you give the timing too quick, it can cause sometimes the client to act out. In other words, if a client suddenly said, you know what, I really don't like how you treated me today, and I say back, that's exactly what you said about your father last week. You didn't like how he was treating you, and what do you think's going on? If I too quickly jump in, it can lead to them acting out and getting upset with me, like, you're not listening to me. I'm gonna complain to your college. It can inflame the situation if you don't work with the transference correctly. And it's your clinical judgment. It's case by case. I mean, we are in clinical practice. We're going to get better at this over time. I'm just explaining to you that it's not just recognizing the transference, it's also knowing when to bring it up and how to say it, how to deliver the message. So if a client, for example, was talking to me about a dream, and they said, well, I had this dream last night that I came to your office, and then when I got there, you slammed the door on my face. And then I woke up. Now, there's lots of ways of handling that, right? A typical response might be, well, how did that leave you feeling? Or why do you think you had that dream? Or, kind of put the ball in their court, right? But if I come back and I say something like, you feel shut out by me, and I represent another part of you, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's this concept that Carl Jung had about the shadow, and we get into this elaborate, convoluted interpretation, right? Where we're trying to interpret reality for them, or we're trying to talk about the transference and flesh it out in terms of figuring out what's going on in the room right now. Because I've talked about in the last video that transference is all about repeating the past. We have relationships from our past that haunt us. Some are in our conscious memory, some are unconscious, some are in both. And when clients are acting in a strange way, or having a very strong reaction to us, positive or negative, it can mean that there's some relationship in the past that's impacting them in the present, and it's impairing their functioning, impairing them from getting where they want to go. That's the basic premise of transference. That's why it's so important. The reason I'm saying this is sometimes what we do with the transference can cause the client to act out more. In other words, as we try to interpret it or we try to work with it, we can cause it to get stronger, or we can suppress it. We can say, look, that's totally inappropriate what you just said. I don't want to be treated that way. Why would you talk to me like that? And we can suppress it. So if you have the wrong dosage or the wrong timing, or you explain it in the wrong way, it doesn't mean that the transference wasn't present. It doesn't mean that the phenomenon isn't there. What it can mean is that how you handle it can cause the transference to act out, or you can suppress it and just push it away. So it's got to come down to your emotional comfort level, like how much you can handle of certain emotions coming towards you. Now, in the literature, transference has this idea of being partly fantasy. And there's a certain meaning of fantasy in the psychodynamic literature, which means just that the client isn't in our current reality. Fantasy is often about unfulfilled wants and needs. This comes from attachment theory, like from John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and Maine. So we have this idea that transference can come from unfulfilled wishes. And Freud referred to that in 1912 when he talked about transference as well. It's been around for over 100 years. And so there's this idea that transference is part fantasy, meaning there's something imaginary about it, and part reality. If a client said something to me like, "It seems like I'm boring you right now," the way I've been trained is that I would think to myself, okay, at least 1% of that is true. Maybe 99% I'm openly curious, I'm engaged, but I have to consider the possibility that what the client's saying is real. In other words, if there's transference occurring in the therapeutic session, I don't automatically assume it's imaginary, oh, it's the past, it doesn't count, it has no accuracy in the moment. In fact, sometimes it can be very insightful. The client can say something like, "Hey, I don't think I'm really interested in you that much as I'm talking." And I might inwardly reflect, think about that for a minute, like, maybe they're onto something. I am kind of feeling bored. What's going on? So I wouldn't necessarily say that out loud. Again, that's timing and tact, but I might say something like, "Well, what are you picking up on? What is it that you're noticing I'm doing or not doing that makes you feel like I'm bored?" In other words, I explore the transference rather than trying to resist it. This idea that transference really is a mix of fantasy and reality, that's important to know. We don't want to just assume that they're in their own world, that it's something from their past and it doesn't really matter. It's something that is inside them, but they can get over it. They can work through it over time. And we don't want to assume also that it's 100% real, as someone saying, "I hate you," or the way you're talking to me right now is just terrible. Well, that can also be part of the fantasy, that what they're trying to do is reenact a relationship in the past from a caregiver, usually a significant person in charge or authority. I will say a lot of what the literature says is that the transference often applies to a mother or a father, right? It gets put onto us. It's not always them, but it's often them. So those are very, very important relationships. It's the important relationships that get reenacted via transference in the therapeutic relationship. And if they've had problems in the past, the client is unconsciously working through transference in order to express that and figure out what went wrong in the past, how to address it right now in the present, and then move forward in the future so they're not stuck with this true self, false self that Winnicott refers to in the literature. Now, those are more listening and being open. Those are story listening skills. Now, the other type of skills I talk about in my second book, Path to the Shadow, which is dedicated only to transference, is the notion of story directing skills. If you think about a movie like Apollo 13, for example, that was directed by Ron Howard. You take that same screenplay and you put it in Steven Spielberg's hands, or Quentin Tarantino, or Spike Lee, right? If you put it in other directors' hands, that screenplay would take a very, very different shape. In other words, there's a story there, and then how we, as clinicians, what I'm thinking is, how are we going to direct the story? Remember, I talked about earlier with a client may want to talk to us about, say, something like they just bought a new house. Okay, now let's say I'm interested in the gardens, right, of the house. Let's say I have a green thumb and I really enjoy gardening, so I immediately ask, how big is the lot? They say, oh, it's 100 by 200. And I jump in again and I say something like, well, do you have a lot of gardens or a lot of trees on this lot, right? See, what they had was a story. I just bought a new house, and now, like a film director, I'm peering at the story and I'm directing it in certain ways with my questions. You have a lot of power in a therapeutic session to steer the conversation in certain ways. So one approach is to be like Wilfred Bion, who says approach the situation with no memory or desire. On the other hand, there's this idea that if a client just keeps talking on and on and on about something and they're having a hard time getting to the point, that's not their fault. Often trauma can reorganize their emotions, or it can disorganize their thoughts. They can have hard time accessing something. They're trying to explain it and they can't. I believe it's important to have story directing skills as well, meaning it's like a flashlight, like a beam of light. Like, where are we pointing our attention? And how we do that is by asking questions and making comments. And wherever we notice things, we can ask and explore and point those things out. So being deliberate and conscious about that, I call story directing skills, much like if you're a director in a film, you're telling people action, cut, stop, we're going to move to this scene here. You know, you're making decisions around which part of the transference relationship you're going to focus on and which ones you're going to set aside for another time, or, you know, maybe not even address at all. So there's that idea that you can think like a director. Like right now on this YouTube video, I'm mentioning some things. I had hundreds of pieces of information about transference. I've got pages and pages and pages of information. All this research that I did. Now, what am I going to select, and what am I going to keep? What am I going to throw? It's the same thing when a client comes in and they're talking to us. It's like, what are we going to explore and focus on, and what are we just going to set aside for now? These are very important skills to have in terms of exploring transference while we're working with people. So let's think about this for a second, right? If you had to record one of your sessions with a client, maybe you wouldn't watch the full hour. You know, you'd notice there's some spots where it gets quieter. Maybe you're chatting about smaller, simpler, everyday things. And then there's these other parts that are really, really important. Sometimes I think to myself, especially when I'm typing up my clinical notes, hey, what's the best part of the session that just happened? Or what was the worst part? What really didn't go well at all? And this comes from the rule of less. What I'm saying to you is that when I'm working with someone in a therapeutic session, I think that whatever I'm focusing on, it has to be good, it has to benefit the client in some way, and it has to have a reason for being there. I really watch if I have the temptation to just chat about something and I don't really have a focus or a purpose. You know, if I had to play back the session I just had with a client, I'd notice, oh, there's some spots there where we kind of went off on a tangent. I don't really know what that was about. And then I came back to something. So what I'm saying here with the rule of less is when I'm working with someone, I often can be very intentional. What am I focusing on? Is it that am I going to pick a particular transferential relationship? Are we going to explore that in depth? Am I just going to be open and see what comes my way, and they can just move from different transference object relations as I'm working with them? You know, how am I going to go about this? So what I often think about is, if I'm talking to a client for a while and it feels like it's not going anywhere, I'm okay with things not going anywhere. It's fine. It's part of the process. But what I'll sometimes do is I'll cut to another part of their story. So using the example of a wedding, maybe you've seen wedding videos before where someone they've got a camera and then they're zooming in on something, and then they zoom back, and then they pan over here, and then they come back. And the camera doesn't have any purpose or any meaning. What I often think about is that my mind is like a video camera, and I want to notice, where am I zooming in? Where am I suddenly zooming out to get detail? So, for example, client says to me, you know, I just went to a wedding on the last weekend. Okay, so I could zoom out and say something like, how many people were there? Or I could zoom in and say, oh, how well, who was sitting beside you at the table? See how I'm using my questions to just pick up specific parts of things? How I'm doing that is going to allow the transference to either emerge or it's going to close down. So they say, oh, there was my aunt and uncle sat beside me. But suddenly, as they're talking about when they were talking to a close friend at another table, they light up. There's some kind of energy there. And I'm thinking, there's something I need to explore. So I zoom in on that, right? transference can come up in many ways. If I see a lot of emotion on their face, if I'm seeing they're having a lot of reaction, or in counterpoint, I see they have no reaction, suddenly they go numb or they have flat affect, I pay attention. What just happened? What just happened internally there, consciously or unconsciously, and then try to explore it. So I'm using my mind like a camera, like I'm doing right now in this video. I'm focusing on certain shots, certain elements of a story. If a story was 1 hour in length, there might be certain pieces I take out that I'm trying to cultivate to see whether there's any transference present or not. Now, the thing is that their shadow, their unconscious mind knows what I'm doing. So it will sometimes make something blurry, meaning, let's say there was a key moment that happened at the wedding, like I talked about. Mother came up to them and said, "You're such a disappointment. Like, why aren't you married like your brother?" It could be that the shadow inside of them makes the shot sort of blurry. Why I say this is, I've noticed when I'm working with clients, there's sometimes when they get really confused or when their emotions get very stirred up, right there, that's the time to zoom in and give them space and figure out what's going on, because often the transference and the resistance is right there because the image they're giving me, the story they're telling me, is kind of blurry, it's disjointed, it's a bit confusing. So, I could be tempted, if someone is telling a story in a non-sequenced way, to try to clean it up, clarify it. That's one of the tools in psychodynamic is clarification. I could be tempted, but what I often do when I'm looking at transference is I let them be confused and I see what comes of it, because often there's layers of emotion underneath that are driving the confusion. They might feel hurt, they might feel angry, sad, guilty. There can be all these things. And so when I know I've got a real intersection of emotion and sometimes they're confused, I zero right in on that point because I know there's deeper dynamics at stake. And then I try to explore that thinking through the lens of transference. Now, some clinicians, when they're gathering information from clients, they're very good at gathering information about their outer world. Meaning, the person goes to a barbecue, right? The client goes to a barbecue, and the clinician may be excellent at saying, okay, what happened? Who was there? Okay, so you came in the door, and then what happened? And what they're doing is they're looking at it like a linear story, and they want to figure out what the parts are. They might have the client describe what the house was like, where the people were, where they sat, right? There's this idea that you can almost paint the picture, the client can paint the picture, and then you feel like you're there, and then you can empathically attune or connect to the client. So if you're a clinician who's good at gathering external details, you might want to shoot with your mental camera in the opposite direction and look at inward questions, like when you were sitting there talking to your friend from work, rather than talking about all the things that were going on around them, say, what were you reacting like on the inside? Were you nervous, anxious? Were you excited to see your friend? Similarly, if you're a clinician who does a lot of inside shots, meaning you're looking often, how did you feel about that? What were you thinking when you said that? You're looking interior. You might want to reverse the direction with your mental camera and shoot outside and give you a wider context. Sometimes when you gather external details to the story, say the client was sitting at a table and talking with a friend at a barbecue, and then you find out there were 8 other people listening, it totally changes the flavor of the story, because that might be something that makes it so they're not saying what they really want because there's a bit of an audience, rather than if it's just 2 people off by the side, they might say something more authentically or more earnestly. So thinking about your camera, think about what is your natural inclination. Do you tend to use inside shots looking inside the client, or do you try to gather information peripherally around the client when they're describing situations, information, and what's going on for them? It can be important when thinking about transference. Sometimes it's important just to suspend reality. In other words, let them be where they are. If a client suddenly regresses and they're very, very upset and they appear like a small child, they're sniffling and crying and they're visibly distressed, trying to say, now, look, we're in a therapy session right now. This is part of it. And you're trying to rationalize or explain away the emotions. Often, if you want to cultivate the transference, you got to forget about reality. You got to kind of let them go in their time machine, go back in time, and then tell you, what is this stirring up? What does this remind you of? You know, what have there been other situations where you suddenly broke down and you don't know why? You know, it's not about making it make sense. So much of therapy can be focused on being practical, solution focused, pragmatic. How are we going to get through this day or this week? Like, what are the skills you're going to work on? You know, are you going to go apply for your ODSP or your OW? Like, we can crunch down on very technical and very pragmatic, down to earth events that occur in therapy. And of course, these things are essential. If a client's homeless, it may not be the time to explore transference. You have to get them housing. So, of course, there's a sequencing to all this. But assuming that, you know, the status quo is there and your client's relatively safe, it can be important to forget about reality. This ties into the video on goal setting around having transitional space, a sense of play, being curious and letting different parts of the client emerge and then seeing where it goes. I think that's a very important element. If we stick too dogmatically to the next things that the client has to attend to, we can lose sight of transference. We can push transference aside. Now, Freud and many other clinicians have talked about how transference really is an expression of unfulfilled wishes. Let's say it's around birthday. It's around the client's birthday and they've come for a session with you. They might have deep wishes of their family treating them a certain way on their birthday, right? But the family has never treated them as well as they liked. And so it's what often happens is if you've been repeatedly disappointed by people that you really care about, you begin to crush your wishes. You don't even think about your wants anymore. You just push them down like, oh, don't even think about that. Now, what we want to do here in transference is we want to explore wishes. The moment a client has a wish, that's a huge sign of transference because it's a direction. It gives the person a direction and a focus. And automatically, it divides everyone in the story involved. As soon as you have a wish, it turns into black hats and white hats, like a classic Western. Meaning, let's say we have a client who wants to return to school, wants to take an online course in photography. There's going to be some people in their life that are going to say, that's ridiculous. You're not going to make any money doing that. Like, why would you do that? Those are the black hats. In other words, they're the ones against the wish. And there's going to be some people that say, you know what, follow your dreams, follow your heart. If that's really important to you, go for it, right? These are the white hats. Our clients are going to be similarly divided inside. There might be parts of them that really wish that they could have it, and then there's going to be other parts that say, no, you know, that's a waste of money. You know, you hardly can put a roof over your head. You know, you can't put money into an online course. That's ridiculous. See, the wish gets crushed. So, allowing the client to feel safe and explore wishes and wants and needs is really an important part of building self-attachment, building healthy attachments between them and the people in their world, and building a good therapeutic relationship with you. Of course, if the client is simply daydreaming and they're always talking about wishing, the therapy doesn't go anywhere. Then we have to explore the next level of stalemate there, right? What's the resistance to go, okay, you recognize the wish, here's what you want to have happen, now what's the next step? Of course, the next step is to be willing to work towards it. If I just keep wishing I lost 30 pounds, I keep wishing, man, I just, so unhappy with how I look in the summertime in a bathing suit, then where's the willing? Like, where are you getting from wishing to willing is now the rubber hits the road. Now you're going to have to start taking steps. But oftentimes when transference is very powerful, wishes get repressed or wishes get skewed off into some direction that just doesn't make any sense. So, for example, a client is deeply distressed and they keep firing the worker that they're working with at a mental health organization. They go through doctor after doctor or nurse practitioner after nurse practitioner. They want the help very badly, but then they reject the help. See, that can be a pattern of transference, of constantly rejecting people that are trying to help you. So to get from wishing to willing is a very, very important step. And then that starts to tie back into the other video on collaborative goal setting, because now we've got something to work with. But part of transference is just letting the client either re-experience in the past, because remember, transference is about defending against a memory, defending against a painful emotion. See, transference occurs when you don't want to re-experience something, but it's so strong you feel compelled to keep going towards it. So there's this idea of repression, regression, and displacement, 3 of the 33 defenses that the Freuds talked about, where we're having complex mechanisms where we keep things out of our awareness, but we secretly want them. Here's an example. You got a client who comes home every day to an empty apartment. Now, deep down, they don't want to be alone. They want to be with someone that really cares about them. But the resistance comes because they're afraid of being rejected. They don't want to go out dating. They don't want to meet new people. They don't want to try new things. It's too frightening. So what do? See, there's this conflict built inside. Part of them wants something to be different. Another part doesn't. It's too scary, right? Transference is often about change. So how did they get to be in an apartment by themselves? Where are the wishes and wants? What is it that they truly want to give themselves through this experience of having a relationship with someone else that cares about them? Exploring those dynamics, you can bet, has something to do with how they were treated in the past, how those other relationships from their past are impacting them right now. So you see, when a client has a wish, it creates a storyline. The moment a client says, I want to lose 30 pounds, there's a storyline. The therapy now has to go in a certain direction. If they say, I'm totally fine with my body image, what I want to work on is my relationship with my kids. See, the moment you have a wish right there, now you've got another storyline. And anything that's blocking the client from getting to that storyline, in other words, getting that result and that outcome, usually stems from transference. They don't want to feel the feelings they had from previous relationships. It's impacting them right now, and then that creates a resistance. And so transference and resistance and defenses, they work very harmoniously together. The shadow is the unconscious part of them that processes all of this and keeps them safe. And yet there's a part of the client coming into practice, into our practice, who wants to change. See, part of them wants to keep it the same and a part of them wants to change. And then that struggle is often unlocked when you understand transference. Now, of course, this video is a fundamental, it's a foundational level of information about transference. Transference is extremely complex. We could do many videos on this. We could have lots of discussion about this. It's a part of every therapy. There's many different transferential patterns, and there's things that you can do to encourage it. There's things you can do to suppress it. You can do things to focus on it, like story directing, or listening with no memory or desire, like Bion. There's so many different approaches to this. The information I'm giving you in this video is what I got from looking in the research literature. And it may not be, of course, the only way. There's dozens, if not hundreds of ways of processing and working with transference. I hope you find this useful and informational for your practice. If you want to ask me questions, you can just leave comments down below. And you can email me at michaelbruinix@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd like to hear anything in your comments about whether you found this useful or not. If you have specific questions about clients, of course, don't use any client identifiers, but you can mention the scenario and I can either respond down below in the comments, or maybe I'll create a video just to address what you bring up. If you're new to this channel, you can consider hitting subscribe. And if you know somebody else who is a mental health practitioner or in your organization who might find this information beneficial, you can share it with them. I sure appreciate your time. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.